Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. How's it going?
Yeah, it's all right. Hanging in there.
Hiya.
Hey
Hi
Katie.
all.
Hey. Um, yeah, so today we are going to be looking at grief and loss, and we chose this topic because it's so incredibly relevant to the current situation with COVID-19. And just to give you a bit of a teaser for the talk today, we're going to be looking at grief and loss and all the different elements of it, so or as many as we can. I think one of the most useful things I always find to do is when we start sessions is to have a look at the kind of word, um, the title of the module. So today, grief. What does grief mean to people? How do people define it? It's a word that's thrown around quite a lot, particularly these days. It's always useful to get a sense of what it means to people. I think following that, it'd be useful to get a sense of what people feel they're grieving. What are the losses that people feel that they're experiencing at this current time? Um, and then kind of following on from that, looking at what are the responses to that grief? What are the responses to those losses that people are feeling? Um, we'll have a look at a few different elements of grief, and then just we'll end by looking at a few models that will help people maybe understand the grieving process and give people a bit of a sense of a framework. Just to underline the session, one of the things that I want to say is that, particularly with this topic, grief is different for everyone. There's a particular researcher that says our own grieving processes are like our own individual fingerprints. Um, Try not to feel ashamed or critical of the emotions that you're feeling or guilty for feeling the things that you're feeling. Like I said, everyone experiences grief very differently here. And again, just before we kind of start the chat, one of the things that I wanted to say, which I think is a useful thing to bring up here, is that grief involves emotions, and not a lot of people know this. The Latin word of the word emotion is emovere, and emovere means to move out. And to me, it's a really powerful visual. I think there's just something really important to hold on to there, that grief is an emotion, and emotions need to move. They need to be moved out rather than pushed down or stifled. So I hope today really helps with that. And gives you a bit of a sense of getting in touch with some of those feelings, putting words to some of those feelings, and kind of working with them in healthier ways. Um, so just to begin with, I'm just curious, everyone, what are your senses of the word grief? What does grief mean to you?
For me, it's a massive sense of loss
Mm-hmm.
of my own self as well right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I hear the word grief and I think of it being a secret and
Mm.
denied.
So some kind of sense of like shame around it?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's one
Yeah.
thing I want to talk about. It's like the shame of, I think shame and grief are very kind of intertwined.
Mm-hmm. What about other people?
Yeah, I think maybe linked to what Liz was saying, that it's something very private and personal, um, that other people can't relate to, kind of thing.
Mm.
Which is probably why it's going to be difficult to talk about this right now. But yeah, no, it's kind of, I think that's a really good point, Katie.
Mm.
And I just want to sort of second that because it's difficult. I feel like I'm in the middle of feeling some sort of grief, and so at the moment it's kind of difficult to be able to put a finger on what it is I'm actually feeling and if it is grief or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said about the level of confusing and conflicting emotions when it comes to grief, but also in general around this current time, because what's happening is so epically big.
I think for me, I would say grief, yeah, loss basically, because it's loss of what you would have shared, the future you could have shared with someone, the future that isn't there anymore. Whether that person's ever existed, like so, if you have a miscarriage or something, or if or if it's partner, and something's happened to them, so you don't have that, you know, future that you thought you would be sharing together. So it's that kind of like loss of the potential life that you thought you would have had.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you can kind of like, you know, say the same about what's going on now. It's kind of that loss of how bringing into kind of like looking at how our normal life was and how much we took it for granted. Like with loss, you take what you've got for granted until it's been taken away from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting, and in a way you've already touched on what I'm about to say, but I think it's worth saying that when you look online, a lot of what's available online is around death of a person. And of course, you know, that kind of brings on tons of grief and tons of different types of senses of loss. But I think there's just something really important about recognizing we're grieving things that have been taken away from us, which, you know, which may not be people. Like you were saying, Heather, it's the potential for something to happen in the future. We're grieving, you know, a future we never had. So I think, you know, grief is interesting because it's much more kind of nuanced than sometimes people, you know, quite often it's just associated with death, but actually there's tons and tons of different losses. It might be worth actually kind of going straight into that. What are the feelings of loss people are experiencing now with COVID-19?
I think I hadn't really sort of identified it into something you just said, Bob, about Heather said as well about something about the future. I feel really furious and frightened and kind of, you know, I don't want to lose all the things I want to do. You know, there's so much I want to do in life, and I feel that that's kind of slightly been put on pause. And yeah, I'm kind of adjusting to this, like, oh my God, well, this might mean that this won't happen or so on, you know. So I think I'm feeling a loss of creativity.
And freedom to do those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's not sort of so obviously like, oh, I'm, you know, not able to go and play, you know, 3 rounds of tennis every Saturday, which I obviously don't do. But, you know, it is something about the future and what I want to do and the potential for what's happening to stop that.
I think one of the things for me, and it's just the going shopping and the queues and the anxieties of people and trying to get food. So what we take for advantage all the time just to go into the shopping, which now would take, you have to plan it because you have to be in the queue and 2 meters apart. And for me, it's surreal. It seems really surreal. I've only read about things like this and watched it. So for me, that just going to the shop now is really overwhelming. It creates quite an anxiety because I don't want to do it, but you have to do it because everywhere you go, there is a queue. So for me, that's really overwhelming, even when I just see the queues outside all the shops and stuff.
I just wanted to kind of pick up on that, just kind of fun, you know, I don't want to make light of it, but I think the other day I went to the shops and I was wearing, you know, mask and gloves and stuff, and I just was so angry about having to do that because this bloody mask kept going in my eyes, and then I dropped my basket and my lemons fell out, like rolled across. It was just so ridiculous, and it was kind of there was an absurdity to that moment where I just felt the sense of like, oh my God, being able to go to the shop and not even think twice about, you know, having to wear a mask and gloves and everything that goes with that.
Yeah, and you know, it's really interesting. I was kind of really glad that we were having this session today, because like I'm really struggling to be able to pinpoint exactly what this loss and grief it is I'm feeling. Like I haven't yet been able to access my emotions properly, and so yeah, you know, like I really agree that it is the things, the wants and the you know, the plans that you had for what you wanted to do in the future or just like not so distant future, but there's something bigger. And like I think, you know, especially today with with this session, it's really helpful for me because, you know, having to kind of like not for so many years, not necessarily accessing your emotions all that well, it's really hard to pinpoint those feelings of loss and grief.
Mm. Do you mind if I ask, do you feel like there's a fear of potentially opening the floodgates?
I think so. I really, do you know what? If you asked me a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I would have been like, no, I feel like that actually this is something we go through, like as human beings in terms of like, and, you know, this is historical, which, you know, really putting kind of like a spin on it. But, you know, I absolutely, I think there is a fear there. I don't think it's so fearful that I don't want to face it, but it's easier at the moment. Like, you know, I have these built up mechanisms which allow me not to face grief and loss.
Yeah, that links to something Tonya and I were talking about the other day, about this thing where, like, on one level, I'm grieving the loss of my routine and my structure and the things that kind of the scaffolding I have that helps me manage my life on a day-to-day basis. But also those things work to like allow me to like avoid, say, much deeper feelings of grief that like aren't even about this thing, but are things that happened ages ago that I've never properly dealt with. And it's like I'm being forced to look at some of that, but it's really confusing because I'm so used to glossing over it. I find that quite relatable.
I actually didn't really find this in the literature, so I'm kind of making up this term, although maybe it does exist. But there's definitely something about this idea of like archaic grief, that, you know, we haven't grieved for things in the past, and I think this current feeling of loss really triggers that. So there is this real present sense of loss, but it's also triggering something very archaic, something very old.
John Heron talks about that.
Oh, does he?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the
Copyright John Heron.
Yeah, Facilitation Handbook. We talk about it on Group Work Day, that some groups are characterized, so i.e. there's lots of people in that group that have real kind of archaic grief, that shit that happened to them that, you know, they've never grieved. And yeah, I think you know, we've hit the nail on the head a bit with this, because I kind of suspect this is what's happening for lots of people, not just people in, you know, recovery from addiction, but lots of people are having feelings and they're like, oh, hold on, you know, it's only because I couldn't get flour at Tesco, you know. And of course it's not about the flour at Tesco. I once had a cat that I really liked called Minnie, and she was always a bit ill, and I took her to the vets and had her put down, and she died in my arms, and my response was totally off the scale. You know, it's like, hey, I was really sad and I really loved her, but, you know, it was like I was crying for, you know, 30 years of not crying. And I kind of, I'm sort of suspecting lots of people have just followed this, you know, that was a noise, that kind of overwhelming feeling that's archaic grief.
And like you said, I think it's really confusing, you know. I think there's something about like going to the shop and not being able to buy, you know, the brand of mayo that you normally buy or something, and having a response that can be kind of, like you said, disproportionate to that instance, but it's not about that. And so I think that can feel really confusing because people's emotions feel quite unregulated or something.
Of course. And of course the instinct when you have an emotion that you don't understand is to shut it down.
Of course, yeah.
Is to go, oh, don't be so stupid. It's lemons, or it's cat, or it's, you know, it's toilet roll, or whatever's, you know, scarce this week. You know, and actually the helpful bit is, I think, probably seeing how you respond to something and examining it a bit and thinking, hold on, rather than just kind of dismissing that, let's think about it.
I guess as well, you know, you kind of go through life, a lot of people, if they haven't kind of necessarily had to deal with, you know, mental health issues, or specifically looking after not their behavior but their way of thinking, you go through emotions in life that you don't necessarily think are like coping mechanisms. These are just things you do, like you go down the pub and you get drunk with your mates, or you go and watch football match, and or you go shopping. You know, all these things that have been taken away.
Yeah.
To kind of like suddenly you haven't got a diversion. You haven't got the diversions that you had, or that you know that you just took for granted. You know, so it kind of would bring up things necessarily that wouldn't have been brought up because you're going through your daily motions. Now you can't do that.
Yeah, and I wonder. I mean, you know, I wonder even if it's all those things like, you know, going meeting your mates, whatever. But also, kind of for a lot of people who know us, you know, it might be going to meetings, and that forms a kind of social function. So it might not. Yeah, it might be that people don't think, oh yeah, I go to meetings to kind of, you know, look at my addiction. I know that goes on, but there's also all those kind of those social elements that people might be missing. But that's a way of coping with grief. Sorry, that wasn't very articulate, but
yeah, no, they're very much so.
Have it Heather's points up there, yeah.
Yeah, no, they're very much so, because you're, you know, because you've got that kind of human collectiveness that you wouldn't have necessarily in a, you know, like a phone meeting. You can kind of interact with each other vocally, but then you're missing out on all that 70% of communication that's not just what you're saying.
Yeah. And of course, we're struggling at the moment because we can't see each other. We're just recording this, so we can't kind of see each other's visual cues and things like that. You know, which is a soothing thing, isn't it? You know, all those you know, small human interactions soothe us, and they can soothe our grief, kind of life.
They soothe us, and those being taken away from us give us a massive sense of loss. You know, it's like you said, you know, it's nice to have this digital contact and to have some way of connecting, and, you know, Zoom meetings and stuff like that, but it's not the same. And I think those things being taken away or broken or being fractured or fragmented, I think, again, just leads to this real sense of something not being there that gave you a sense of who you are. I think, and that to me, I think is a really big part of this topic. I think when I was thinking about this and my own kind of feelings of loss, there were feelings of my yoga community being broken apart, or my kind of routine being kind of broken, or like us as a team being kind of broken apart, loads and loads of things. And I think for me, like, all of those little small things add up to this big thing, which is my identity and who I feel that I am. And I remember, like, at one point kind of feel like I've kind of I've got used to a lot of this stuff now. It feels like, you know, the new norm is kind of settling in quite quick, but there was definitely the sense of free falling, the sense of kind of not, the ground that I've been used to walking on for all these years suddenly no longer existing.
I think, sorry, I pressed my mic and it didn't work. I think that idea of like the ground you have been used to walking on not existing, for you, Bob, your identity's been quite established for quite a long time, but for people who might be listening to this that are sort of relatively new into recovery, you know, that ground's pretty shaky. Or pretty new. Sorry, shaky is probably the wrong word. But, you know, I know myself, you know, my own sense of self in early recovery was very raw. I felt like a baby. And then, you know, that's even more frightening when that sense of self is just wiped away. You know, if you're old like me and you've kind of felt like, oh yeah, I know who I am for many years now, you know, I got the kind of resources I feel grateful for. But yeah, if your sense of self is really new, that's going to be really, really frightening.
Absolutely. What are some of the kind of emotions, or actually not emotion, I mean, think a better way to think about this is like, what are some of the responses people are having to the loss, of which, you know, there is an emotional response, there are behavioral responses, there are kind of cognitive responses, like the kinds of things that people are thinking. Like, so just thinking about the discussion we just had about what we feel we're grieving for, how are some of you responding to those things?
Well, you know, I retreat like into my imagination. So it's like I fantasize, and like I kind of can back away from reality really, really easily. Like, It's a complete and utter coping mechanism, but it's just kind of like I can go into the imaginary world kind of zone. And, you know, on top of that, I build up, and this is like really behavioral, but, you know, I build up barriers. I put big kind of walls in between my feelings and myself. And, you know, it's something that, you know, I obviously have done a lot of work on, and this, that, and the other. But those, I think, are, you know, still my go-to kind of responses when I am feeling emotionally threatened.
Can I just ask how you feel about those being your responses?
You know, I would say that in certain cases they can be helpful short term. So, like, you know, it's okay that when you've kind of, I don't know, whatever's happened, if you've had an argument with somebody, I don't know, whatever the situation is, you can retreat into kind of like, you know, fairy tale land or whatever. And, you know, that helps. It's short term. But like, you know, what I feel like, and me and you, Bob, we've worked together for kind of like, you're my supervisor, you know a lot about this, you kind of understand you know, we've spoken a lot about this, but like long term, like I still feel that, you know, actually I have some awareness of it now, but I still do it, and that makes me feel powerless. I feel really powerless at the moment. So that's how I feel.
I'd say for me, the first 2 weeks I was really lost. I felt like a child again. I felt really powerless, as Bex just said. And yeah, I felt a little bit out of control of my emotions because I just kept crying all the time, like randomly. And then when I sort of looked at that, I feel that I'm crying about stuff that has also happened years back as well, because I've never had to sit with myself as long as I have this last couple of weeks. But now this week, I think I've sort of, my response is to really sort of get some control back in my household. So trying to keep a routine going, and that's my way of getting through this right now. The first 2 weeks was pretty much, I felt like my whole life was just ripped away from me, and I felt like really, really fragile. But then looking at my responses as well is to be busy and I need to be in control, like a lot of other people will feel this. And so for me, I think I've had to implement control in the household.
Might be worth saying at this point, I just kind of, you know, those words you just said were actually really powerful. You know, it was ripped away from you. And I think like one of the, because I do the down trauma, and one of the things that unites every kind of event which leads to some kind of traumatic reaction in the body is that it's unexpected, you know. And I think the very fact that it just comes out of nowhere and, you know, rips something away from you or happens to you in this very unexpected way is really traumatic.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, and like you said, you know, this stuff can kind of bring up, you know, past stuff and past trauma. So I'll say something about that a bit later on, because I think there's an interesting kind of definitional description of that particular type of grief, where it's like one type of traumatic event or kind of grief response over the top of another one, But yeah, it's massive.
I think it links to sort of what we've been talking about, archaic stuff as well, because just hearing kind of Bex and Tanya speak, my response is I get really angry and furious. And as a child, I was really furious. And I think I was furious as a child because, you know, I was neglected. And I'm just, I mean, you know, it wasn't a cognitive thing. It was a pure visceral, emotional fury at not being looked after. I'm laughing because it just, you know, I was really, really cross as a child. And I just go like, fuck this. I get really, really angry, and I'm mainly angry at the government. But yeah, I kind of see it as a way of coping with grief. And it's an old way of coping with grief. You know, it's it's archaic.
What does that do for you? Like, I'm just kind of curious, what Bex was saying around kind of like, I mean, all of these different responses, like every single one serves a purpose. Like, I guess, like, I'm curious about, like, what does the anger do for you, and what does it feel like? Can you also maintain that and sustain it? Like, how does it kind of, I don't know, like, how do you sustain that?
Yeah, well, you can't.
Yeah.
But you can't. I mean, this session is going to overlap with the next one we're going to do, which is about feeling emotionally overwhelmed, because these responses we're talking about, come into those 4F responses of flight, fight, freeze, fawn, and this is a fight response, right? And it's you can't sustain it because it just exhausts you. So at some point, I think I just get pissed off with myself, get bored of myself, and become, sort of like, oh, I just sort of think, oh, just fuck it, don't know what that is. That's probably giving in response, but yeah.
But it's also probably kind of like finishing your energy reserves to sustain it. So at some point you can't.
Yeah.
What about other people, like your current responses that you can name?
I guess kind of like knowing that I have to kind of like really dig deep with my coping mechanisms, because I haven't kind of got those things like just go to see a friend, get kind of that love and support from friends. And not being able to go to work and do the things that kind of, I don't know, validate me, make me feel like I'm doing something useful with my life. So it's kind of like very much doing extremes, like cleaning, mopping, hoovering, stuff, not excessively, but yeah, just kind of being aware that that's where I'm putting my energy, and listen to a lot of music really loudly, dancing around, and kind of exercising and stuff, like physical stuff seems to be sort of helping, but it's stuff that's not something that I generally would do, I guess. And I think it's that thing like Bex was saying, is like, not really being in touch with my emotions, but kind of wary that they're there, and there's a potential to for kind of like to drag me down into the negative ones. And being quite kind of careful to not go there, I guess. And and in doing so, kind of being constructive in a kind of weird way, because I'm kind of doing lots of stuff, not kind of like finishing much. I'm finding it very difficult to focus on things. I can't really concentrate. I like sit and watch the telly, of an evening, or film or stuff. I'm kind of doing quite a few things at once, like flitting around. Yeah.
Are people sleeping okay?
Yeah, I'm sleeping well. I'm sleeping well.
I'm
exhausted from all anger.
Sorry, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I was getting up early, but I've actually started to sleep until 9 o'clock, which is like
whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa, Tonya, you
I know. I couldn't believe it.
Breaking records.
Lay-ins in the morning. I couldn't believe it.
For those of you who don't know, Tonya notoriously gets up rather earlier than the rest of the team.
The birds.
Apart from Bex, actually.
Yeah, I second that, Tonya, because we're both early birds. Like I love a morning me, but these days, like I can't wake up. Like I find I really struggle waking up. like I feel just emotionally knackered.
Yeah, I'm not sleeping very well, and I've never been a great sleeper anyway, but I don't know. I think being confined so much is making me notice it a lot more. I think maybe because one of my coping mechanisms used to be just going out and being busy, and whilst thankfully, like, I am able to be at home without driving myself too mad, like nowadays, compared to like a lot of the self-destructive behaviors that I used to do if I was just left alone at home. I'm used to being a lot busier during the day, which in a way meant that like I was just really knackered, and when I finally got to bed, I would just, like, my head would hit the pillow and I go straight to bed. And I'm really struggling to get to sleep and stay asleep at the moment, and I'm noticing it a lot more. I think just because I don't spend as much energy during the day.
Well, you kind of just destroyed my theory, Katie.
Oh no.
No, I'm joking. But I think it's just something we were talking about the other day around kind of like one of the things that I'm really noticing is I'm similar to you. Like, I would have a very busy schedule and be kind of running around, and I've got lots of energy kind of generally, but I would just then get home and kind of crash. And if I was ever at home normally, like at the weekend, and didn't do anything, like I wouldn't be expending the energy, so I wouldn't sleep. But I'm finding I'm having really, really, really deep sleeps. And I think one of the things we were talking about the other day is that even though a lot of people are confined, and well, I mean, everyone's confined, but obviously responding in different ways. But I think a lot of people, there's this emotional kind of the emotional toll of what's going on, whether it's kind of news or just thinking about stuff, or even actually pushing stuff down, that takes energy as well. And I think a lot of people are expending a lot of their kind of what would have been their physical energy in this very emotional way, whether they're aware of it or not. Because it just feels like a lot of people are sleeping longer, or they're sleeping kind of more deeply, or but yeah, there's obviously going to be exceptions to that. It'd be interesting to just kind of just pause for a moment and just kind of introduce you to, some of you may know some of this stuff, but it was really interesting kind of delving into grief literature the other day and looking at researchers have basically kind of come up with various descriptions of grief. And I think it's quite interesting. There was tons. I was really surprised at how many there are. And I think they're kind of useful, and like anything, the different things I'm going to say, they provide a bit of a name for a type of grief or a label for a type of grief, but it's just a label, and we're more kind of complicated than that. And I think there's overlap, and so to try to avoid tagging yourself with a particular label and then diagnosing yourself as like, oh, this is what I've got now. But if some of these descriptions help you understand an element or an aspect of your grief, then I hope that that's what they will do. So one of the ones I wanted to introduce to you first was normal grief, and that's basically the kind of when people are grieving for some kind of loss, but it's not debilitating grief. There is actually a term for that as well, which is called chronic grief, where people basically just can't get up in the morning and can't kind of function. And then another one, which I think is worth bringing up now, is this idea that both you, Liz, and Heather talked about when we first started, which is about this kind of sense of grief about things that you've lost that would have happened in the future. And it's called anticipatory grief. So that's the sense of loss for things that would have been. And I'm kind of thinking a lot, I mean, I don't know, Tonya, like with your daughter, like her education, as she was doing her GCSEs, and just her education and the sense of her future. I mean, I can't imagine what she must be going through in terms of what she feels she's lost in terms of education. Now, you said that she's finding it really hard.
Yeah, no, she is. And she's, I think, definitely feeling that anticipatory because of her results are going to be coming in, and so all the work that she's done is not actually going to be sort of based on that. It's going to be based on other stuff. So she's really, prom things she's left school the other day sort of. So yeah, lots of stuff has sort of changed for her, and I think she's got quite a lot of that anticipatory grief going on
Anticipatory,
now.
yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't work out, like in America they say anticipatory. And I'm just kind of guessing we say anticipatory, but I could be completely wrong. Another type of grief that's worth mentioning here is inhibited grief. And again, kind of connects to what you were saying, Beck. So this is this sense of kind of inhibiting or kind of pushing down the emotions related to grief. You know, in a way to kind of be able to function to get on with your day. But I think one of the things is, for a lot of these things, whether it's like a person pushing their emotions down, or whether it's like you were saying, Liz, kind of being angry, in the short term, there's an absolute purpose. There's a kind of healthy function to those things. They're called adaptive responses. But when those things go on long term, they become maladaptive. So as an example, with inhibited grief, if that is something which, you know, you as a person, you're pushing down your emotions related to grief continuously, so you're never allowing the grieving process to even start. You know, go back to what I said about the root word of emotion. You know, these emotions which need to move have no motion whatsoever, but they will try to come out. So what you see here is people get a lot of insomnia, or they have like digestive problems because they're, you know, the stress is going to their stomach, or they're kind of grinding their teeth at night and getting migraines and things like that. So it's kind of interesting where like the mind wants to kind of push something down, but the body still has the response.
We were, as a team, we were discussing, as we do, we were discussing Freud and defense mechanisms the other day online, and actually, you know, what you're just discussing or talking about, Bob, is the return of the repressed. In Freud's language, it's like stuff that you repressed pops up again, you know, whack-a-mole style.
Yeah, good visual. Another one that I already kind of mentioned it before when you were talking, Tonya, is this idea of cumulative grief. So you may already be grieving for something in the past, consciously or unconsciously if it's archaic. And so cumulative grief is this idea of, you know, another layer of grieving taking place on top of something that you're already grieving for. Of course, you can, you know, have multiple layers, so you can imagine the kind of impact of that is huge. And then the final one, which is, you know, really relevant, is this idea of collective grief. And so collective grief is something that like a society might go through, or a nation might go through, like when there's been natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina, or like a tsunami or an earthquake, or something like 9/11, so kind of terrorist attacks and things like that. So there's this kind of real sense of like a whole nation, for instance, going through something together, kind of grieving together, trying to kind of process something together. And I was thinking a lot about this and just thinking about how when this has happened before, to my mind, collective grief has always had, as far as I know, I mean, I guess there are anomalies like Spanish flu and stuff, but generally in kind of recent memory, they tend to be pinned to one event. So it's like 9/11 obviously happened on 9/11, and then, you know, there was the kind of what you call it, the kind of group, help me out, what's the word, like when people kind of came together and marked the death, you know, almost kind of like a collective kind of funeral for people that had died. You know, there was a real kind of a moment in time where people came together, were able to grieve, put a full stop at the end of that, and then kind of in a way carry on with their lives. A similar thing happened with Princess Diana, you know, like she died and then there was the funeral and this massive outpouring of grief. And I think what's incredibly different about the current situation is that there's no time to pin this on. We have no idea when this is going to end. You know, it's just this kind of really open-ended collective grief.
Can I just say something that you just made me think of with those examples? Because with Princess Diana and also like 9/11, I was reading something about Judith Butler, and she has written something that's about the kinds of lives that are grievable, and that when it comes to like public displays of grief, that can be almost like an interesting thing to look out for, basically. That like in 9/11 people were grieving like American citizens who've been killed by these terrorist attacks, but we don't publicly grieve like all the people that have been devastated by other forms of American military intervention. And like just what you said then about what we're going through at the moment, the kind of lives that are grievable, you know, it's a lot of elderly people, a lot of like poorer people in society. And I wonder whether that's got something to do it, that it's not a publicly shared grief, because a lot of the people that are suffering are like a lot of the people who are invisible a lot of the time in society.
Yep, nice point. Really, one of the things that makes me really angry, and is that there's lots of discussion on Twitter at the moment about the language that the government's adopting about Boris Johnson fighting the virus, and people, you know, being heroic and you know, strong. And actually, one of the things about grief, and we talked earlier about the shame around grief. You know, the shame is around vulnerability, and it makes me really angry, because it is, if there is a kind of, you know, discourse or a discussion about how really strong people are fighting this, it's like, oh, what, that the people that die aren't strong enough then? Oh, they just died because they didn't fight enough, you know? Absolutely shocking. Infuriates me. Sorry about that. There you go. And also, I was thinking, like those instances of Diana, I didn't feel any grief when Diana died. I remember it really well, because I was somewhere particular when it happened. Actually, I was stoned on heroin when it happened, and I was up all night, and I switched on the television, and it was there, and I was just like, oh, fucking hell, you know? But actually, a really perhaps a more helpful example of grief is Hillsborough and Liverpool. And actually, that was also combined with a sense of injustice as well. And it's interesting the way that collective grief has formed a real strength in that city.
That's really good. And the Grenfell example, actually, as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess kind of one of the things that, again, with these, I've just realized the word I was thinking about earlier was kind of memorials. So whether it's Grenfell or Hillsborough or Princess Di, I mean, I guess the other thing, just really quickly to say, it's kind of connected to those points, but also kind of slightly on a slightly different note, is this idea of one of the things that's being denied to people is the option or the ability to have, you know, the ability to have a kind of a collective mourning of something, so like a funeral, or to be there when someone dies. You know, these kind of rituals that we have in society to be able to mourn a loss really aren't there anymore. And that's going to have an impact, or people are going to have to find kind of new and creative and different ways to do it. So just a bit conscious of the time, so I wanted to just quickly kind of on the finish line, so I wanted to just kind of have a look at a couple of models to help people maybe understand the process they're going through in terms of grieving. I don't want to spend too long on this, it would be kind of too overly theoretical, but there's a kind of three that kind of stood out for me. One of them, the word is kind of just really annoyingly kind of cold and technical, but it's this model called the dual process model. And the dual process model of grief basically says that there are two kind of modes of functioning when it comes to grieving, and we flip between them kind of a lot. So it can be kind of maybe from day to day, but it can be from kind of minute to minute. And I just thought it was useful to bring this one up, particularly because there was something about, so one of the modes is called loss orientation, again, kind of not particularly helpful term, I don't think. But so loss orientation relates to the mode of operation which is related to expressing the range of emotions relating to grief and relating to the loss. And the other one is called restoration orientation, which is kind of more you just trying to adjust externally to the loss and kind of having to get on with your day-to-day life and meeting the demands of kind of day-to-day life. And I found that quite helpful because I think a lot of people are feeling like they should be better at grieving or they should be better at expressing their emotions and kind of actually forgetting that, you know, there's a real kind of practical element of like also having to get on with our day-to-day functioning and all that requires of us. So that's kind of one model. So this idea of kind of actually flipping between those two modes is actually really normal and really healthy according to this these two people. Really quick mention of Kubler-Ross. So Kubler-Ross kind of couldn't do grieving and loss theory without mentioning her name. Kubler-Ross, famous for the 5 stages of grief, originally called the 5 stages of hearing catastrophic news. Not the catchiest name of a model in the world, so she changed it to the 5 stages of loss, or the 5 stages of grief. And so those 5 stages she talks about are denial, anger, which she talked about earlier, bargaining, depression, and she said the final stage was acceptance. Later on in her life, she did say that the grieving process isn't linear, and there isn't kind of a time frame attached to it. I think initially she had put one, but now, well, towards the end of her life, she said there wasn't. So one of the things that I think is useful to know about or to understand about this is that people go from stage to stage and can kind of flick between them. So you might go from kind of anger to acceptance but then back to anger again, or bargaining to depression to acceptance and then back. So I think there's just something helpful about I think those different stages being kind of identified. I used to always think that the one that was missing from here was guilt. And I think when you start reading, I've never read any of her books, but I think she does kind of talk about that. But I think that's also something the guilt and also the shame is involved in that process as well. Anything people want to say before I move on about those?
No, I really identify with the dual process model.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like sort of fleeting positive, negative quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, just to say that actually both of those are positive.
Yeah, and I feel that as well. I don't feel sort of, I think it's quite a healthy process that I'm sort of going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost a bit like practical, emotional, and actually both of those things kind of really important.
Yeah, because I think it's quite important to actually feel our emotion as well and understand so that we don't get lost in it.
Yeah. And just there's another model which, I mean, all of these are going to be in the handout that accompanies this chat. So there's a model which it's got a slightly annoying and cringeworthy acronym called TIA, because obviously we're talking about sad things. But so this is a guy called Worden, and he basically kind of identifies these 4 different stages, and he calls them the tasks of grief. And he said the first one, T, is to accept the reality of the loss. So, in a way, part of Kubler-Ross's kind of model is this whole denial aspect. And this is saying, you need to bloody well accept what's going on. The second one, E, is to experience the pain of the loss. So again, Tony, you were saying about the importance of feeling your emotions and having a space and creating a space where you allow yourself to feel the pain of the loss, because there is pain connected to those losses. The third stage is to adjust to the new environment without the lost person or the lost object. And then the last one is R, which is to reinvest in the new reality. And there's something to be said about the fact that, the new reality is such an unknown to us. It was a bit of a chat we were having earlier. There's something about we have no idea what this new reality is going to be. But in terms of this model, one of the things that I think they're trying to get across here is at this last stage is some people call it post-traumatic growth. So it's kind of, the difference between coming out of this with some sense of post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. And this idea of kind of hopefully finding meaning and then investing in this meaning. So he talks about reinvesting in this new reality. And I think there's just something about trying to kind of, invest energy into this new meaning that hopefully people are able to find.
There's as you're talking about, I've just reminded of something where there are certain plants in the Australian outback that only grow after fire. So it's a kind of nature, it's nature doing its thing. I mean, obviously this is not related to the catastrophic fires they had last year or this year, but there are kind of organisms or organisms. There are plants that need the bushfires to grow. There you go.
Yeah. I mean, there's part of, I guess maybe you're going to talk about this in the next session, but kind of part of what I'm kind of really feeling is like being overwhelmed by information because I'm actually really gripped by everything that's going on. I feel like I want to read kind of loads of articles about different things, but there is definitely like a lot of the stuff that I'm reading about is how this current situation is almost a bit of a kind of shaking up of the snow globe, a kind of a snow globe that really needed to be shaken up, and trying to get a sense of what configuration things will fall into, and desperately resisting the urge for things to fall back into the same kind of patterns or grooves as before. So this idea of kind of crisis can bring opportunity rather than crisis just meaning crisis.
I think something that I've been thinking about for myself for the past few days, because we've been like discussing as a team grief, but also these other emotions, is just like how important hope is to get the other side of grief kind of thing, and to feel like, for me anyway, it's like hope feels important to kind of as a motivator, as like a reason to keep going, even though there are lots of unknowns. So I don't know where I'm going with it. It feels like that's something that I want to explore for myself, as like not a way to like paper over grief, but like as a nice kind of supportive thing to explore, like rather than feel stuck or overwhelmed by grief.
I guess as well, we've been kind of taught for the last 30 years that to be individualistic, to think about ourselves, not worry about other people, there's no such thing as society, all that kind of stuff. And this has just taken us to realize that we have power amongst ourselves. Our actions have consequences among everyone else, so it's kind of like that thing of like, you can't ever be alone in this world, because we are all human beings and we're all sharing the same experience to a certain extent.
Wonderful. I think one of and it relates to what I know that I think we want to do with these kind of recordings, podcasts that we're going to put out, is that we are just people in the middle of this, talking about what's happening. We're not experts. We're people that kind of know a bit about psychology because it's what we do, and then we're going to use that. But actually, I think that the aim is very much for us just to come together as best we can, and just to be human with other humans is incredibly powerful.
and try to make sense of things together.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally agree.
I think just kind of picking up on the hope thing and what you were saying as well, Heather, I think it feels like, yeah, this is kind of like a, maybe not a reminder, but it's like a kind of like, it's a way of being, what's the word? It's a way of kind of being shown what's possible and kind of who we can be when the structures around us start to dissolve. Like, I think like that to me is kind of what I'm kind of gripped by, and I guess that, you know, the things that I've seen in terms of what people are doing and have been doing for each other, I think are really inspiring, and that gives me a sense of hope.
Yeah, very much so. I think, you know, you can see that people have been like stepping up. They've been looking after each other. There's been like this huge growth in that mutual age groups where people are going out of their way to help complete strangers, you know, because we haven't had necessarily the, you know, to have the really dangerous ineptitude of people in control going against, you know, World Health Organization decrees and advice, and it's not been kind of like a straightforward way of being told the best way to do things, and people get kind of confused by those mixed messages. But it's kind of that thing of like that common sense thing of knowing how you can help someone else and kind of doing that anyway. So people, you know, kind of stepping up.
Mm.
Yeah.
Alrighty, well, I think this is probably a good time to end, and just to remind everyone that there's going to be a handout attached to this topic, and we'll put on a few other suggestions for kind of further reading and research. And we discovered yesterday that Groundhog Day was apparently based on Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Grief. May revisit that myself. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.